In 2019, Jake traveled to South Korea for an open audition. He lied to every friend he had back in Australia. Rather than telling them why, he said it was for his dad's work. He was terrified they'd see him fail, believing lying instead was a good thing. However, it took him years to learn that hiding like this was a mistake in itself. If you enjoy thoughtful videos about enhypen just like this, consider subscribing. Jake had a habit of running through situations in his head before they happened. He'd been mentally rehearsing absolutely every possible outcome until he felt ready enough for something. It'd been that way for years. However, that didn't make his life as an idol easy. Jake debuted with enhypen on November 30th, 2020. If you were to have listened to their debut album, Jake's voice would be the first voice you hear. Jake narrates the story, dropping you straight into the world of the album. On top of that, he's exclusively speaking English. At this point, he's freshly 18, having only just aged up 2 weeks ago. The first thing this world hears from this brand new group is a kid from Australia, yet he almost passed out from the pressure of recording it. Jake's job here was incredibly stressful. Everyone would hear him first, and it required him to speak clearly in English, the same language he used to lie to everyone when he left Australia. That language had allowed him to slip out of his old life. Now it was leading the life he dreamed of. For a few years, Jake narrated every single intro and outro a part of enhypen's albums. There were times other members narrated, but it was primarily Jake's role. Those sections on their albums belonged to him. He was born in South Korea, but largely grew up in Brisbane and Cairns, Australia. His dad stayed behind in Korea for work during those years, flying out every few months to see them. For a while, that's all anyone needed to know about him. He was the Australian narrator, the one who shines as bright as a puppy, the member the group turned to first in English interviews, always calm and always ready with an answer. He was good at that part. Jake later admitted that during his first couple of years as an idol, he just hoped for the best on the hard days and tried to forget them. He never really stopped to ask why trying to forget about them felt easier than actually telling someone. Telling someone he was struggling would have made him seem weak. He chose this dream, a dream thousands of people would give up anything to have. He didn't have the right to feel bad. He needed to stay strong. And so the bad days didn't disappear. They just got buried underneath the guilt of having them in the first place, with each day stacking on top of the last. At the time, nobody knew any of this. Jake just seemed like someone that was incredibly ambitious. He'd usually find himself overthinking any mistakes he's ever made, regardless of however minor they truly are. Whether that be a wrong step or a facial expression he didn't like, one mistake, and he'd start spiraling, replaying it in his mind and beating himself up over it, long after everyone else had moved on. None of the 6 people he'd eventually live with knew any of this either. Majority of the people in the audience watching Jake, really watching enhypen, probably didn't even notice his mistake. But that wasn't the thing that mattered. Jake had grown obsessed with the idea of improving and perfecting his performance. It didn't matter whether or not engines noticed his mistakes. Jake did, and that was all it took to drive him crazy. But then, in a way, it wasn't just about the performances themselves. Back during Island, enhypen's survival show, Jake's mindset was that he can't drag the people around him down. He'd only trained about 9 months at this point. They often performed in groups. And the last thing he wanted was for his lack of experience to become an excuse. He was fully conscious of what the others were doing, especially Hee-sung, who had trained for over 3 years at the point of Island. Jake felt determined to push himself through, even despite his shorter training period thus far. The mindset he developed there carried over even after debuting. If anything, the whole situation got worse. Instead of just trying to prevent dragging the training team down, Jake was now terrified of dragging a group as established as enhypen down. He pushed himself through the survival show, but once he actually debuted, things only got harder. Once the pandemic started lifting up, he got to see all the people that now loved him. With it easing up though, that meant Jake and enhypen's schedules just got busier and busier. Yet through all of those changes, The one thing that stayed consistent was what he chose not to show. Jake's position in enhypen was fully decided by global votes, where he received the third highest count out of every trainee on the show. The producers, who served as the judges for a large portion of the series, referred to him as the icon of growth, given how much he'd improved in such a short time. However, nobody voting for him saw what that improvement actually cost him deep down. This version of Jake is what the world saw first. In January 2026, Jake would write and produce his own track with the help of another member, but first, he had to figure out how to say anything at all. Jake can't really let anyone get close. Not all the way, at least. While Jake was growing up in Brisbane, his dad stayed behind in Korea for work, flying out every few months and then flying back to leave again. Every time his dad left, Jake cried heavily. He was anxious, lonely, and missed him the whole time he was gone. Most nights, it was just him, his mom, and his brother. Jake would help his mom prepare dinner every day, something he thought every family did until people started complimenting his cooking and realized it wasn't. Because of his absence, Jake ended up learning how to keep functioning as though those emotions weren't there at all. It hurt him every time, but life still had to go on every morning. He still had to prepare dinner. At some point, he stopped showing that it hurt, even when something was very much so getting underneath his skin. And 2 years later, mid-performance in Seoul, the thing he'd spent years holding down would finally slip. But for now, he was going to fight those feelings with everything he had. In 2025, Jake sat down for an episode of BYOB. Towards the end of it, Jake praised the show for being one of the most fun interviews he's been a part of. One of the hosts directly asked him how he overcomes feelings of sadness.
If I'm being like 100% honest, I don't really feel sad. If I'm about to feel sad, I make it stop. It's like kind of like a defense mechanism for me.
By calling it a defense mechanism, he already knows what he's defending against. Making himself still isn't something he needs anyone else's help to do, because it's something he can do alone, in the exact second he needs to, without waiting on another person having to be there for him. He learned that lesson long before he even auditioned for Island. Every goodbye at the airport taught him the same thing, that needing someone is a gamble. And the last time he let himself feel one all the way through, the person still got on the plane anyway. Feeling it didn't make his dad stay. It just made the house quieter without him. However, one of the hosts, June, who's actually a veteran K-pop idol himself, warns Jake of this defense mechanism he's developed.
Kind of like a defense mechanism for me.
So you got good self-control with that.
But you know what, that's scary though, if you do that because you're controlling your emotions, one day it can explode.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to let the grief out.
Sometimes you need to let it out. But I was exactly like him when I was a kid because of the situations that I was in.
Jake certainly didn't have to shake his head in agreement to what he said. He absolutely could have fought back and demanded it was the right thing for him specifically. It was July 2023, just 2 years earlier from that conversation. On day 2 of enhypen's Fate tour in Seoul, Sunwoo told the rest of the group that Jake had cried earlier, with Jake trying to explain what happened. He'd been talking to fans from one side of the stage, the side he'd parted his hair towards on purpose, when someone on his in-ear told him to move to the other side instead. Earlier in the set, tears just started flowing out of him. Some engines initially believed he was in pain while performing. However, Jake explained there was more to it. My inner self was having a hard time, he said. There was still one more song to go, so instead of letting the tears flow out, he held them back. His inner self believed he still needed to do his best.
와, 근데 이거는 빡세게 해야 된다 이러면서 진짜 이 악물고 했구나. 진짜 이 악물고 엉덩을 막 했는데 와, 나 그 제가 그 표정을 찡그렸거든요.
By the end, Jake was laughing about it, calling the whole thing funny. That was the same exact instinct Jake talked about on BYOB, just caught in real time rather than a description of his mechanisms. The tears didn't come from anything Jake could point to, because he'd gotten so used to managing them before they surfaced that he never learned to catch them on the way up. By the time he felt them, they were already too far along to stop. What he could still try and control was whether anyone saw. Criminal Love had heavy popping left in the choreo, and a crying face doesn't pop the same way a fierce one does, but people did notice. Once the moment passed, he didn't reflect on it much at all. He turned it into a joke before any of the members could ask anything more, because a laugh ends the conversation quickly. Jake isn't the member people instinctively worry about. He's the one who smiles like he's got nothing bothering him, who turns crying into a joke before anyone can ask about it. The things he uses to cope are the same ones that make people love him in the first place. The smile looks fine. The jokes sound funny. There's nothing inherently alarming, so nobody notices anything. Those are usually the people who've gotten best at making sure there isn't anything to notice. Being worried about means someone noticed you couldn't handle something, and handling everything was a part of what he believed his job was. Around this same period, Jake said he'd figured it out. However, it sure didn't seem that way. I mastered how to release stress fast. I find relief from even extremely trivial things. Going home and having a late night snack with Heesung, or playing games with the other members. He wasn't wrong. That part was absolutely helping, but mastering how to release stress fast and actually letting someone help you aren't the same thing. The members got the version of Jake that showed up for late night snacks and easy nights in. What they didn't get was what made those nights feel necessary in the first place. 3 years after this, Jake would stand on a stage in Australia and declare the members were his family, but he wasn't at that point yet. In June 2023, during the Dark Blood era, Jake was asked about the 6 people he'd lived with since Island and performed every comeback with. The interviewer noted he'd once said he'd never met anyone he could give his 100% to before the members. Jake said it still took him relatively longer to open up to them, even then, that he's still in the process of opening up to them. He'd already called it a defense mechanism in this same interview, before BYOB, before anyone had the chance to advise him about his habit. By 2025, he'd already been using that exact phrasing for years, potentially even longer. Devoting 100% to a person is hard for anyone. For Jake specifically, he mentions that knowing nothing is ever constant. He'd understood that before he had words for it, back when he lived in a house that drew quieter every few months. What made it harder was that opening up requires knowing what you're dealing with well enough to express it to someone else. In the same interview where he described this wall of sorts, he said he's still getting to know himself. Everything he'd built to stay steady emotionally depended on not looking too closely, gritting his teeth to fight his feelings, laughing something off before it had the chance to be addressed, finding relief in a late night snack rather than a real conversation. It all worked the same way. Knowing yourself means looking directly at the thing you spent years learning not to examine. What the other members got was everything he felt like he could give them while keeping his inner self protected. Back during Island, Jake viewed Heesung as an inspiration. Even now, Jake described Heesung specifically as someone he finds relief with. That part was genuine, but Heesung is also someone who sees him at 2 in the morning. He knows what Jake's face looks like when something's wrong, and yet, in a way, he still lives 20 feet away from Jake. A crowd of 60,000 people only ever see what Jake decides to show them. He even mentioned that he almost never cries, except for when he's at fan meeting concerts. The members get to see into those gaps a little bit better, which is exactly why he struggles to be completely honest with them. With those fans, they're complete strangers who will never attempt to ask him a follow-up question about why he cried that night. But with enhypen, there's the chance they'll ask him what happened, trying to help him out, but in a way Jake has learned to avoid. What if they asked and he didn't know what to say? In 2020, Jake's parents came to visit him in South Korea. At some point during that trip, they looked at his face and asked him what was wrong. Not because he said anything, not because something had visibly fallen apart, just because they could tell. He mentioned that because of how they noticed, it took a huge weight off of his chest. Most notably, he didn't explain what that weight was, or how long it had been sitting there. He didn't have to, because his parents had a reference for his face that nobody else in his life had. They'd watched him long before Island, long before the audition lie he told, and long before he felt he needed to prevent people getting too close to him. They'd known his face his whole life. Everyone else had the version he decided to show them. With his parents, he never really had to find the right words. His parents saw him before he got the chance to deflect, and for once, that was enough. However, 4 years later, he was still considering blocking his emotions and keeping people out a self-defense mechanism. 1 year prior to BYOB, on March 5th, 2024, Jake uploaded a cover of Bozzy's I Don't Think I'm Okay to enhypen's YouTube channel. Jake had 2 or 3 other songs he'd picked out. He even sang through all of them, but chose Bozzy's because he related to it more than anything else on the list. The lyrics described something he hadn't been able to say directly himself, which made choosing the song easier than finding his own words for the same thing.
I see my mama in a little bed over here, and even when I see her, I know she knows that it isn't me here.
Sounds pretty familiar, huh? It's very easy to see why this song was the one that stuck out to him the most. He re-recorded certain lines multiple times after the video was already shot. Your average viewer wouldn't have recognized what he viewed as mistakes, but those lines were special to him. They were words he wanted to be sung as great as they deserved. The same day the cover went up, he went live on Weavers. He said he used to feel pressure to only show the perfect and bright side of himself, that somewhere along the way, that changed. And that live, he acknowledged that saying your feelings out loud really helps you, and that you gotta tell people about your feelings. And that's what I learned. Jake claims to have been learning, but we know from his interview in 2025 that he hasn't actually mastered that yet. Truthfully, opening up about how you feel isn't easy. It's so incredibly easy to tell someone else how crucial it is, but it's tough to follow through on it yourself. Jake is no stranger to that. He wants to do better, he truly does, but that doesn't make healing any easier. Around March 2025, an interviewer asked Jake if there was anything about life he was genuinely afraid of. Unsurprisingly, he responded there was almost nothing. However, there was one unavoidable fear he dealt with: someone precious leaving. On March 14th, 2026, enhypen performed at the Hello Melbourne K-Pop Festival at Flemington Racecourse. Jake stood on a stage in the country he grew up in. 5 years ago, barely anyone in Brisbane knew what K-pop was, but now the racecourse was totally full. When the show ended and it was time for his ending mint, Jake just expressed what he was feeling.
Yeah, I left Australia about 6 years ago to become a K-pop idol, and now I'm here with the members, with my family. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy. I'm just happy.
He said it 3 times. He wasn't sure how else to describe how he felt. The members were standing beside him, his family as he called them. Since the time he debuted, he'd struggled to open up to people, to his fellow members. But over time, he learned to work through it and better connect with them, so much that he calls them his family. It's possible his blood-related family was there that night. Every time Jake's dad traveled to Korea, he cried, but he never resented him for it. He might not have always been there for Jake, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try to care for him. When Jake debuted, his dad would send him vitamins and insist he takes them and grow stronger. Jake mentioned it's something his dad has actually always done, ever since he was just a baby. Years prior, when Jake lived in Australia, his father was too busy working in South Korea. But ironically, Jake was now living the exact same way. He mentions it'd been so long since he'd been back to Australia, far too busy with the work he took on. But being back made him happy. Even if it meant he couldn't stay forever and he had to say goodbye, he was happy to be back there, with the family he learned to let in. If you want to see how Sunwoo fought his way through Island despite being kicked out several times, you can click the video on screen. And if these thoughtful breakdowns help you love enhypen more, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.